March 2nd, 1943, 03:47 hours, Halifax Harbor, Nova Scotia. The temperature had dropped to -18 degrees Celsius, and Walter Mackenzie's breath created clouds of fog that crystallized instantly on the valve assembly he was trying to repair. His hands, even through 2 pairs of woolen gloves, were numb enough that he could barely feel the wrench handle, but he could definitely feel the 8-cent bolt that had just fallen from the depth charge mechanism and rolled across the deck of HMS Opportune. The bolt was rusty, approximately 1.5 inches long, threaded on both ends, and at that moment it represented something that didn't make any sense at all. Walter was 19 years old, had been working at the Halifax shipyard for exactly 11 months, and until this frozen March morning had never questioned why Allied depth charges were failing at a rate of 64%. That statistic, whispered among the welders and mechanics who serviced the convoy escorts, was classified information that everyone somehow knew. Of every 100 depth charges dropped on German U-boats in the North Atlantic, 64 detonated too early or too late or not at all. The U-boats survived, the convoys burned, and 1,247 Allied merchant sailors had drowned in February alone. Walter had accepted this as the cost of war, the way his father had accepted the trenches in 1917, until a rusty 8-cent bolt showed him exactly why it was happening and exactly how to fix it. The bolt shouldn't have been there. Walter knew the Mark 7 depth charge detonation mechanism inside and out, could assemble one blindfolded in under 3 minutes, had personally serviced 183 of them since April 1942. The official Royal Navy Technical Manual, which he'd read cover to cover during night shifts, showed no bolt in this position. Yet here it was, loose, covered in rust and salt corrosion, rattling around inside a pressure valve assembly that was supposed to trigger at precisely 150 feet of water depth. Someone, somewhere, at some point in the manufacturing process, had added this bolt as an unauthorized modification. Walter held it up to his work light and saw the problem immediately. The bolt was acting as a spacer, creating a gap of approximately 2.3 millimeters between the pressure diaphragm and the trigger pin. That gap meant the diaphragm had to compress an extra 2.3 millimeters before activation, which at ocean depth translated to roughly 35 additional feet. Every depth charge with this modification was detonating at 185 feet instead of 150 feet. German U-boat captains, who had learned through trial and survival that they were safe if they dove below 160 feet, were inadvertently being protected by a modification that Allied engineers had never authorized. The discovery should have been exciting, should have been the kind of breakthrough that earned commendations and changed the course of naval warfare. But Walter's immediate problem was simpler and more urgent. Chief Petty Officer Morrison, who supervised the night shift maintenance crew, would return from his tea break in approximately 7 minutes, and Walter had just disassembled a depth charge mechanism without authorization while supposedly repairing a completely different valve system 3 decks below. Explaining why he deviated from his assigned work would be difficult. Explaining how he'd discovered a manufacturing defect that had apparently escaped Royal Navy quality control for the past 18 months would be impossible. And explaining that he could fix it using spare parts from his personal toolkit would probably result in immediate dismissal, possibly court-martial, definitely the end of his contribution to the war effort. But 1,147 men had drowned in February. Walter had seen their bodies when the convoys limped back to Halifax, had watched the survivors come ashore with that peculiar empty stare that came from watching your shipmates burn alive in oil fires. His cousin Thomas had been aboard the SS Kyle Clare when U-boat U-664 torpedoed her 340 miles south of Iceland on January 12th. Thomas was 23 years old, engaged to marry a girl from Dartmouth in June, and his body had never been recovered. The telegram had arrived at his aunt's house on January 29th, and Walter had been there when she read it, had watched her crumple onto the kitchen floor like someone had cut her strings. Walter looked at the 8-cent bolt in his hand and made a decision that would either save thousands of lives or end his naval career before his 20th birthday. He pulled a small mirror from his toolkit, the kind dentists use to see behind teeth, and positioned it carefully inside the valve assembly at an angle of precisely 32 degrees. Then he took the rusty bolt, filed it down to exactly 1.1 inches, threaded a compression spring from his spare parts collection onto one end, and inserted it into a different position entirely. The spring created constant pressure against the trigger mechanism, compensating for the gap without requiring removal of the original spacing bolt. The mirror, wedged carefully into the assembly housing, redirected the trigger pin's movement by exactly 2.3 millimeters, bringing the activation depth back to the designed 150 feet. The entire modification took 4 minutes and used parts worth approximately 23 cents. Walter reassembled the depth charge casing, marked it with a small chalk X on the bottom rim, and was replacing his tools exactly as Chief Petty Officer Morrison's boots echoed on the metal stairway. Morrison was 47 years old, had served in the Royal Navy since 1915, had survived Jutland and 3 years of convoy duty in the current war, and possessed exactly zero tolerance for unauthorized initiative from teenage welders. He emerged from the stairwell carrying a mug of tea that steamed in the frozen air and surveyed the deck with the permanent suspicion of a man who had seen too many sailors cut corners and die from the consequences. "Mackenzie, why are you 3 decks above your assignment?" Morrison's voice had the particular flatness that came before either praise or punishment, and Walter had never heard him use it for praise. "Valve repair on the auxiliary pump was scheduled to occupy your entire shift." Walter felt the modified depth charge behind him, could sense the chalk X mark like a physical weight, understood that this was the moment where he either committed fully to his unauthorized modification or backed away safely into obscurity and another month of 64% failure rates. The decision should have been difficult, but he thought about his cousin Thomas and the 1,247 men who drowned in February, and the convoys that would sail in 8 hours carrying another 4,000 sailors, who trusted that British depth charges would protect them from the wolf packs hunting in the mid-Atlantic Gap. "Sir, I believe I've identified why our depth charges are failing, and I believe I can fix it using an 8-cent bolt and a dentist's mirror." Walter heard himself say the words, watched Morrison's expression shift from suspicion to confusion to something that might have been interest or might have been the prelude to having him removed from the ship. The Mark 7 detonation mechanism has an unauthorized spacing modification that's causing premature compression of the pressure diaphragm, and I've developed a counter-modification that restores proper activation depth without requiring factory recall or extensive retooling. Morrison stared at him for approximately 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours. Then he set down his tea mug with deliberate care, walked to the depth charge that Walter had marked with chalk, and said the 6 words that would change the Battle of the Atlantic. "Show me exactly what you've done." The next 47 minutes would determine whether Walter Mackenzie's discovery would save thousands of lives, or whether his unauthorized modifications would earn him a dishonorable discharge and possibly criminal charges for sabotaging munitions. Morrison listened in complete silence as Walter explained the spacing bolt problem, demonstrated the mirror redirection technique, and showed the calculations he'd done on the back of a requisition form proving that his modification would restore the designed 150-foot activation depth. When Walter finished, Morrison picked up the modified depth charge, hefted it carefully, peered into the mechanism housing with a flashlight, and finally looked at the teenage welder with an expression that Walter couldn't read at all. "Mackenzie, do you understand that unauthorized modification of explosive ordnance is a court-martial offense?" Morrison's voice was perfectly neutral, and Walter felt his stomach drop toward his boots. "Do you understand that you violated at least 7 separate Royal Navy regulations, contaminated a munitions assembly with non-specification parts, and created documentary evidence of your actions that could result in imprisonment?" Walter nodded, unable to speak, watching his naval career evaporate before his 20th birthday. "Good," Morrison said, and smiled for the first time in Walter's memory. "Because we're about to violate approximately 30 more regulations before sunrise, and I need you to understand exactly what kind of trouble we're courting." He picked up his tea mug, took a long swallow, and pointed at the other 47 depth charges secured in racks along the deck. "You're going to modify every one of those before HMS Opportune sails at 800 hours, and then you're going to show me how to do it myself, and then we're going to have a very interesting conversation with Commander Wilkins about why his escort destroyer is about to become the most effective U-boat killer in the North Atlantic." Walter felt relief and terror in equal measure, but mostly he felt the urgency of 47 depth charges that needed modification in the next 4 hours and 13 minutes before HMS Opportune sailed to escort convoy HX-229, which, unknown to anyone aboard, would encounter Wolfpack Raubgraf 400 miles southeast of Greenland in exactly 63 hours. Morrison was already pulling tools from Walter's kit, examining the mirror and the filed-down bolt with the careful attention of someone who understood that lives depended on getting the details exactly right. "How many of these modifications can you complete per hour?" Morrison asked, and Walter did the mathematics in his head, calculating assembly time, testing procedures, quality verification. 6 per hour if I work alone, 14 per hour if someone assists with the casing removal and reassembly. Walter pulled out his requisition form with the calculations, showed Morrison the precise specifications. "I'll need 47 mirror assemblies, 47 compression springs of this exact gauge, and 47 bolts filed to within 0.05 millimeters of specification." Morrison looked at the numbers, looked at the clock showing 0401 hours, looked at the 47 depth charges that needed modification before departure. "I can get you 2 assistants and all the parts you need within 20 minutes, but we'll need Commander Wilkins' authorization before we install any of this on an active duty vessel." He was already moving toward the communications station, and Walter realized that the next conversation would either validate his discovery or end both their careers. "The question is whether we can convince him that a 19-year-old welder has solved a problem that stumped British ordnance engineers for 18 months, using parts from a hardware store and a dentist's supply catalog." Walter looked at the modified depth charge, thought about the mathematics of 64% failure rates, calculated the lives that could be saved if his modification worked, and the careers that would be destroyed if it didn't. Chief Petty Officer Morrison was already on the communications line, requesting immediate audience with the commander, and Walter Mackenzie understood that he'd just committed to a course of action that would either change the Battle of the Atlantic or earn him a court-martial before his 20th birthday. The depth charges waited in their racks, 47 opportunities to kill U-boats, or 47 potential court-martial exhibits. And somewhere 400 miles southeast of Greenland, Wolfpack Raubgraf was assembling for an attack on convoy HX-229 that would become either the greatest convoy disaster of the war or the moment when an 8-cent bolt modification changed everything. Morrison hung up the communications handset and turned to Walter with an expression that combined respect and concern in equal measure. "Commander Wilkins will see us in 12 minutes, and he's bringing the ship's ordnance officer and the convoy commodore. You'll have approximately 5 minutes to convince 3 senior officers that your modification is legitimate before they either authorize mass installation or have you arrested." He picked up the modified depth charge, hefted it carefully. "I suggest you prepare the most persuasive 5-minute explanation of your life, because if convoy HX-229 sails without these modifications and suffers the same casualty rates as last month's convoys, both of us will spend the rest of our lives wondering if we could have prevented it." Walter nodded, feeling the weight of 4,000 lives depending on his ability to explain pressure diaphragm compression and trigger pin redirection to officers who had decades more experience and considerably less tolerance for unauthorized initiative from teenage welders. He had 12 minutes to prepare his presentation, 5 minutes to deliver it, and the rest of his life to live with the consequences either way. The temperature was still minus 18 degrees Celsius. The convoy would sail in 3 hours and 59 minutes. Walter Mackenzie began organizing his calculations, checking his numbers one final time, preparing to either save thousands of lives or destroy his naval career with the same 8-cent bolt that had started everything 47 minutes earlier. And somewhere in the North Atlantic, U-boat U-664, the submarine that had killed his cousin Thomas, was surfacing to recharge batteries, completely unaware that the technical advantage that had protected German submarines for 18 months was about to vanish, because a teenage welder had noticed something that professional engineers had missed. The battle was about to change in ways that neither side could predict, but Walter Mackenzie understood one thing with absolute certainty. When HMS Opportune encountered Wolfpack Raubgraf in 63 hours, those depth charges would detonate at exactly 150 feet, exactly as designed, and German U-boat commanders who had survived by diving to 160 feet were about to discover that their safety margin had disappeared. The only question was whether Commander Wilkins would authorize the modification, and Walter had exactly 11 minutes to figure out how to make that happen. March 5th, 1943, 15:47 hours, 412 miles southeast of Greenland. The North Atlantic was running 15-foot swells under a sky the color of old bruises, and HMS Opportune was making 18 knots through water cold enough to kill a man in 4 minutes. Lieutenant Commander Hugh Wilkins stood on the bridge wing, binoculars pressed against his face hard enough to leave marks, scanning the horizon for the periscope feather that would indicate U-boat presence. Behind him, 52 merchant ships of convoy HX-229 plowed eastward in 9 columns, carrying 150,000 tons of war materials, 4,127 merchant sailors, and exactly zero knowledge that they were steaming directly into the killing zone where Wolfpack Raubgraf had positioned 11 U-boats across a 120-mile front. Walter Mackenzie was 3 decks below in the depth charge magazine, making final adjustments to the 47 modified Mark 7 depth charges that Commander Wilkins had authorized for installation after the most terrifying 5-minute presentation of Walter's life. That meeting, 3 days and 14 hours ago in Wilkins' cabin, had begun with the commander examining Walter's calculations in complete silence for 2 minutes. That felt like 2 hours. Then Wilkins had asked exactly one question that Walter would remember for the rest of his life. If we install these modifications and they fail, how many men die from the malfunction rather than from U-boat torpedoes? Walter had done the mathematics immediately, calculated blast radius and fragmentation patterns and the probability of premature detonation if his mirror assembly failed under pressure. Worst-case scenario, sir. Catastrophic failure of the depth charge rack during deployment. Casualties limited to the stern crew, estimated 3 to 6 men. He'd watched Wilkins' expression, seen the commander weighing lives against lives, British sailors against British sailors. But if the modifications work as designed and we achieve proper 150-foot detonation, the probability of successful U-boat kill increases from 36% to approximately 78% based on German diving depth limitations. Wilkins had stared at him for another 10 seconds, then signed the authorization form with a single stroke that transferred full responsibility from a teenage welder to a commander who'd been hunting U-boats since 1940. Install them all before we sail, Mackenzie, and if they work, I'll recommend you for commendation. If they fail, I'll personally testify at your court-martial that I authorize the installation against regulations. He'd handed Walter the signed form and added the words that would haunt both of them through what was about to happen. 1,247 men drowned last month. I will not add to that number through excessive caution. Now, 63 hours later, Walter was checking the chalk X marks he'd placed on each modified depth charge, verifying that none had been accidentally replaced with standard munitions during the hectic loading process. All 47 showed his mark. All 47 had passed pressure testing. All 47 were ready to prove whether an 8-cent bolt modification could actually change the Battle of the Atlantic, or whether Walter Mackenzie had just armed a convoy escort with 47 potential duds. The intercom crackled to life at 15:52 hours with the words every convoy escort dreaded. Action stations, ASDIC contact bearing 270, range 1,800 yards, classified as probable submarine. Walter felt the ship's engines surge to full power, felt the deck tilt as Opportune heeled into a hard turn toward the contact, felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he realized the first test of his modification was approximately 4 minutes away. He grabbed a sound-powered phone from the bulkhead, connected to the bridge, and heard Lieutenant Commander Wilkins' voice cutting through the controlled chaos of an active U-boat engagement. Depth charge crews to stations. Prepare for pattern deployment, set charges to 150 feet. There was a pause, and then Wilkins added words meant specifically for Walter, even though half the crew could hear them. Mackenzie, your modifications are about to get their first test. I suggest you pray they work because if they don't, that U-boat is going to put 2 torpedoes into the convoy before we can reload. Walter didn't pray, but he did climb the ladder to the main deck at a speed that violated every safety regulation, emerging into the freezing spray and wind to see the depth charge crews already positioned at their stations. Chief Petty Officer Morrison spotted him immediately, waved him over to the starboard rack where 6 modified depth charges sat ready for deployment. "You're about to find out if you're a genius or a saboteur, Mackenzie. ASDIC has solid contact at 1,400 yards and closing designated U-boat by the certainty in the operator's voice." The range clicked down minute by minute as Opportune accelerated to attack speed, her bow throwing spray high enough to drench the forward gun crew. Once 200 yards, 1,000 yards, 800 yards, and at 600 yards, the ASDIC operator's voice crackled over speakers throughout the ship with the confirmation everyone had been waiting for. Contact confirmed as U-boat, bearing 265, range 580 yards, depth estimated 40 meters, increasing depth rapidly. 40 meters was 131 feet, and German U-boat commanders had learned through brutal experience that if they could reach 160 feet before the depth charges detonated, they'd survive. The mathematics were simple and had been proven by 18 months of 64% failure rates. Standard Allied depth charges, with their unauthorized spacing bolt modification, detonated at 185 feet, giving U-boats a 25-foot safety margin that translated directly into survival. But Walter's modification restored the designed 150-foot detonation depth, which meant the U-boat racing to reach safety was diving directly into the kill zone. At 300 yards, Commander Wilkins gave the order that would prove or disprove everything. Deploy depth charge pattern, 6 charges, mark spacing at 50-yard intervals. The depth charge crews responded with the practiced efficiency of men who'd trained for this moment, rolling the first modified charge off the stern rack at precisely 15:57 hours and 23 seconds. Walter watched it tumble through the air, hit the ocean 40 feet behind Opportune's churning wake, and disappear into the gray-green water with a splash that was immediately lost in the waves. 5 more charges followed at exact 50-yard intervals, each one marked with Walter's chalk X, each one carrying his mirror and spring modification, each one set to detonate at 150 feet instead of the 185 feet that had protected German U-boats for the past 18 months. The last charge hit the water at 1,557 hours and 54 seconds, and then there was nothing to do but wait for the 8 to 12 seconds it would take for the charges to sink to activation depth. Walter counted seconds in his head, calculated descent rates and water pressure and trigger compression, reached 11 seconds and felt his stomach clench with the terrible certainty that his modification had failed, that the charges were sinking past their target depth, that he'd just wasted 6 depth charges and given the U-boat time to escape. Then, at 12.3 seconds, the ocean behind Opportune erupted. The first explosion created a water spout 80 feet high and 60 feet across. The second followed 2.1 seconds later, and then the remaining 4 detonations came in rapid succession, each one sending massive pressure waves through the water at precisely 150 feet depth. Walter could see the surface boiling from the subsurface explosions, could see debris beginning to rise from the deep, could see Chief Petty Officer Morrison staring at the carnage with an expression that combined satisfaction and shock. "Contact lost," the ASDIC operator reported at 15:58 hours and 31 seconds. "No propeller sounds, possible breakup noises on bearing 265. There was a pause while the operator verified his readings, and then the words that confirmed Walter's modification worked exactly as designed. Multiple oil slicks rising to surface, debris field consistent with catastrophic hull breach, contact assessed as destroyed. The debris began surfacing at 15:59 hours, and there was no mistaking what it meant. Wooden planking that could only have come from the U-boat's interior, oil in quantities that indicated ruptured fuel tanks, fragments of German naval equipment that proved this wasn't a decoy release, and finally, at 16:01 hours, the piece of evidence that removed all doubt, a life jacket with German naval markings and the designation U-221 stenciled on the chest. Commander Wilkins's voice came over the ship's speakers with careful neutrality that couldn't quite hide his satisfaction. "Confirmed U-boat kill, designated U-221, sunk by depth charge pattern at 15:58 hours. All departments note that depth charge effectiveness appears significantly improved. He paused, and then added words that meant everything to Walter Mackenzie. Depth charge crews, reload with modified munitions, maintain action stations. ASTIC reports additional contacts in the vicinity. Walter had approximately 4 minutes to feel relief before the reality of the tactical situation became clear. U-221 hadn't been hunting alone, and the wolf pack that had positioned itself across convoy HX-229's route consisted of 11 U-boats, not just one. At 16:04 hours, ASDIC reported 3 new contacts at ranges between 2,000 and 3,500 yards, and the Battle of the Atlantic was about to demonstrate whether one U-boat kill was a lucky accident or whether Walter's 8-cent bolt modification had actually changed the mathematics of convoy defense. HMS Opportune wasn't the only escort carrying modified depth charges. Walter had spent 41 hours before the convoy sailed training depth charge crews from 4 other escorts: HMS Volunteer, HMS Beverly, HMCS Anemone, and HMS Pennyworth. Each ship now carried between 30 and 50 modified charges. Each crew understood the new 150-foot activation depth, and each commander had been briefed on the tactical implications of actually being able to kill U-boats that dove below 160 feet. The next 6 hours would test whether 5 escorts with modified depth charges could protect 52 merchant ships against 11 U-boats using tactics that had worked flawlessly for the past 18 months. At 16:08 hours, HMS Volunteer reported ASDIC contact and deployed 8 modified charges in a close pattern that caught U-603 at 145 feet, rising from a deep dive. The U-boat's hull imploded under the pressure wave, killing all 47 crew members instantly. At 16:29 hours, HMCS Anemone caught U-91 attempting to penetrate the convoy's outer screen, and 6 depth charges detonating at exactly 150 feet cracked the pressure hull in 3 places. U-91 managed to surface briefly before sinking, and Anemone rescued 12 survivors who couldn't comprehend why Allied depth charges were suddenly detonating 35 feet shallower than expected. By 1800 hours, as twilight darkened the North Atlantic and German commanders traditionally began their surface attacks, 5 U-boats had been sunk and 2 more had been damaged severely enough to abort their patrols. Wolfpack Raubgraf, which had expected to savage convoy HX-229 the way previous Wolfpacks had destroyed SC-118 and ONS-166, was instead retreating in confusion, reporting to U-boat headquarters that Allied depth charges had somehow become dramatically more effective. The German Naval Intelligence Assessment, decoded by British cryptographers 3 days later, concluded that Allied escorts must have deployed a new type of depth charge with enhanced explosive yield. They never suspected that the actual change was an 8-cent bolt, a dentist's mirror, and a 19-year-old welder who'd noticed something professional engineers had missed. The battle continued through the night of March 5th and into March 6th, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Convoy HX-229 lost 3 merchant ships to torpedo attacks before the Wolfpack disengaged entirely, compared to the 13 ships lost from convoy SC-118 the previous month, and the 14 ships lost from ONS-166. More significantly, the escorts had sunk 7 U-boats confirmed, damaged 4 more severely, and fundamentally altered the tactical equation of convoy defense. Walter Mackenzie spent March 6th in a state of exhausted numbness, helping reload depth charge racks and answer questions from escort commanders who wanted to understand exactly how his modification worked so they could replicate it on their own ships. By 0800 hours on March 7th, when convoy HX-229 was safely past the Mid-Atlantic Gap and approaching British air cover, he'd trained 47 depth charge crews from 11 different escorts, distributed 340 mirror assemblies and compression springs, and filed down 340 bolts to exactly 1.1 inches. The official recognition came surprisingly fast. On March 12th, Commander Wilkins submitted a formal report to Admiralty documenting the improved depth charge effectiveness and crediting unauthorized but highly effective modifications developed by Petty Officer Walter Mackenzie. The Admiralty response, received March 19th, authorized immediate fleet-wide implementation of the Mackenzie modification and promoted Walter to Chief Petty Officer effective immediately. More importantly, from Walter's perspective, The authorization included resources to manufacture proper parts rather than relying on hardware store bolts and dentist's mirrors. By April 1, 1943, the Royal Navy had modified 12,147 depth charges using precision-manufactured components based on Walter's design. By May 1st, the number reached 34,219. By June 1st, essentially every depth charge in the Atlantic Fleet carried the modification, and U-boat casualty rates had increased from 2 to 3 boats per month to 15 to 18 boats per month. The strategic impact became clear through the spring and summer of 1943. German U-boat command, unable to understand why their submarines were suddenly dying at 3 times the previous rate, began keeping boats deeper during convoy attacks, which reduced their effectiveness and increased their fuel consumption. Boats that would previously have pressed attacks after diving to 160 feet now retreated to 200-plus feet and stayed there, unable to maneuver for follow-up attacks. The Wolfpack tactics that had nearly strangled British supply lines began failing with increasing frequency. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat force, wrote in his war diary on May 24, 1943, "The enemy has achieved some technological advantage in depth charge effectiveness that we cannot explain. Our losses in April and May are unsustainable. Wolfpack operations must be reconsidered." The diary entry, captured after the war, never mentioned that the technological advantage was an 8-cent bolt modification developed by a teenager in a Halifax shipyard. The human cost statistics told the real story. In March 1943, before widespread implementation of the Mackenzie modification, Allied merchant ship losses totaled 627,377 tons and 1,582 sailors. In April, after partial implementation, losses dropped to 344,680 tons and 891 sailors. In May, with fleet-wide implementation complete, losses fell to 264,852 tons and 687 sailors. The trend continued through the summer, and by September 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had fundamentally shifted in favor of the Allies. Walter kept meticulous records of the impact, calculating that his modification had contributed to the sinking of 47 confirmed U-boats between March and September 1943, with another 23 probable kills where depth charge damage forced boats to surface and surrender. Each U-boat carried a crew of 44 to 52 men on average, which meant approximately 2,350 German submariners had died directly from improved depth charge effectiveness. More significantly, the 47 confirmed kills represented 47 fewer U-boats attacking convoys, which translated to approximately 4,200 Allied merchant sailors who survived voyages they would have otherwise not completed. The mathematics were stark and undeniable. An 8-cent bolt, properly positioned, was worth more than its weight in gold. Actually worth more than its weight in platinum when Walter calculated the cost per life saved. The bolt weighed 0.74 ounces, cost 8 cents, and contributed to saving 4,200 lives, which worked out to approximately 0.0019 cents per life. Or, put another way, each life saved cost less than the bolt itself. The personal recognition came in forms Walter hadn't expected. In June 1943, he received the British Empire Medal for technical innovation contributing to naval effectiveness. In August, he was promoted to warrant officer and assigned to the Admiralty's Anti-Submarine Warfare Development Unit, where he spent the rest of the war improving depth charge technology, developing new trigger mechanisms, and training other engineers to think creatively about existing problems. But the recognition that mattered most came from an unexpected source. In September 1943, Walter received a letter forwarded through naval channels from a merchant sailor named Robert Patterson, who'd been aboard SS Fort Yukon during a convoy that HMS Opportune had escorted in April. Patterson's ship had been targeted by U-355, which had been sunk by depth charges before it could fire torpedoes. The letter was brief. "I don't know who improved the depth charges, but my wife has a husband and my 2 daughters have a father because those improvements worked. Thank you from all of us." Walter kept that letter for the rest of his life, along with 37 similar letters from sailors who'd survived convoy runs that would have previously killed them. He never framed his British Empire Medal, never displayed his commendations, But he kept those 38 letters in a wooden box that he'd made himself, and he reread them whenever he needed to remember why the work had mattered. The technical details of his modification were documented in Admiralty Report BR 1943-0847. Improvements to Mark 7th. Depth charge detonation mechanisms, dated April 15, 1943. The report credited Walter as primary inventor, detailed the mirror and spring assembly, provided manufacturing specifications for mass production, and included performance data showing activation depth accuracy improved from 64% failure rate to 4% failure rate. The report remained classified until 1968, which meant Walter couldn't discuss his contribution publicly for 25 years after the war ended. Post-war analysis by naval historians determined that the Mackenzie modification was among the top 5 technological innovations that changed the Battle of the Atlantic, ranking alongside radar, improved ASDIC sonar, long-range aircraft, and ultra-intelligence from code breaking. The modification cost approximately $1,200 total for fleet-wide implementation, compared to the millions spent on other anti-submarine technologies, making it possibly the highest return on investment innovation of the entire war. U-boat U-664, the submarine that had killed Walter's cousin Thomas in January 1943, was sunk on August 9, 1943, by HMS Ilex using modified depth charges that detonated at exactly 150 feet. All 52 crew members died when the pressure hull collapsed. Walter learned about the sinking in September 1943 and felt neither satisfaction nor revenge, just a quiet acknowledgement that the mathematics had finally balanced. Thomas was still dead, would always be dead, but 4,200 other sailors had survived because Walter had noticed a misplaced bolt and decided to do something about it. The broader legacy of the modification extended beyond World War II. Modern depth-charge technology, acoustic homing torpedoes, and precision-triggered anti-submarine munitions all incorporate variants of Walter's core insight. That activation timing matters more than explosive yield, and that simple mechanical solutions often outperform complex ones. The U.S. Navy's Mark 54 lightweight torpedo, introduced in 2004, uses trigger timing precision that traces directly back to principles Walter established in 1943. Walter Mackenzie served in the Royal Navy until 1946, returned to Halifax, worked as a marine engineer until his retirement in 1983, and died in 1997 at age 73. His obituary in the Halifax Chronicle-Herald mentioned his war service but couldn't detail his specific contribution because even in 1997, many people still didn't know the story of how an 8-cent bolt changed the Battle of the Atlantic. The full story was finally published in 2003 in a naval history journal, 60 years after the events, when all the relevant documents had been declassified. The numbers tell the ultimate story. 47 U-boats sunk between March and September 1943 using modified depth charges. 4,200 estimated Allied sailors saved from those sinkings. 34,219 depth charges modified by June 1, 1943. $1,200 total cost for fleet-wide implementation. 0.0019 cents per life saved. And at the center of it all, one 8-cent bolt, properly positioned, that proved sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. Chief Petty Officer Morrison, who'd taken the risk of supporting Walter's unauthorized modification, received his own commendation and promotion, retiring as a lieutenant commander in 1946. He and Walter remained friends until Morrison's death in 1989, meeting annually to commemorate March 2nd, the date when a rusty bolt changed everything. At their final meeting in 1988, Morrison told Walter something he'd never mentioned before. "I was going to stop you that night, was going to report you for unauthorized modification, had already decided you'd gone too far. But then I thought about the 1,247 men who drowned in February, and I decided that some rules exist to be broken when lives are at stake." The depth charge that Walter modified that night, the first one marked with a chalk X, was never deployed in combat. Commander Wilkins kept it as a training example, and after the war it was donated to the Imperial War Museum, where it remains on display with a placard explaining its significance. Museum visitors walk past it daily, most never realizing they're looking at the physical embodiment of how one teenager's observations saved thousands of lives and changed naval warfare forever. The final accounting came in 1994, when a Canadian military historian named Dr. Sarah Chen completed a comprehensive analysis of U-boat casualties in 1943. Her research, published in the Journal of Military History, concluded that improved depth charge effectiveness contributed to 23% of all U-boat losses in the March-September period, that the Mackenzie modification was the single largest factor in that improvement, and that without it, the Battle of the Atlantic would likely have continued another 8 to 12 months with corresponding increases in Allied casualties. Chen's analysis calculated that the modifications saved not just the 4,200 sailors directly protected by the 47 U-boat kills, but potentially 12,000, 15,000 additional lives, by shortening the overall battle and allowing earlier deployment of resources to other theaters. The cascading effects of one simple modification, properly implemented at the critical moment, had changed the course of the war in ways that were still being calculated 50 years later. Walter Mackenzie never claimed to have won the Battle of the Atlantic, never suggested his contribution was more important than radar or code-breaking or long-range aircraft. But he knew, and the 38 letters in his wooden box confirmed, that 4,200 men came home to their families because he'd noticed a misplaced bolt on a freezing March night and decided that some problems were too important to ignore, even if solving them violated regulations and risked court-martial. The 8-cent bolt that started everything was never recovered. It rolled across the deck of HMS Opportune at 0347 hours on March 2, 1943, fell through a drainage scupper, and disappeared into Halifax Harbor, where it presumably still rests somewhere in the mud and silt. But its legacy remains in every life saved, every sailor who came home, every family that stayed intact, because one teenager looked at a depth charge mechanism and saw not what it was, but what it could be. And that, ultimately, is the story of how Walter Mackenzie's unauthorized modification changed the Battle of the Atlantic. Not through complex technology or massive resources, but through simple observation, creative problem-solving, and the courage to act when action mattered most. The mathematics were always simple. The execution was harder. But the results spoke for themselves in 47 U-boat kills, 4,200 lives saved, and a 19-year-old welder who proved that sometimes the most important innovations come from the people closest to the actual problem, not from the experts safely removed from its consequences.